Hello, my name is Dan Corlette. Title of this talk is Predicting Which CVEs Will Next Appear on CISA's Exploited in the Wild CVE List. A little about my background. So currently I'm the head of research at NorthStar. Started out with a BS in computer engineering and then started work at Hewlett-Packard in Santa Rosa, California in the Lightwave division R&D, where we worked on a lot of the test and measurement equipment, fiber optic test and measurement equipment for a lot of the telecoms. Then went on to pursue a PhD in computer science, where I focused on large-scale social network analysis and applications of natural language processing. And a little bit overlapped with that for about 13 years. I did applied research in natural language processing and machine learning, both in research and commercial spaces. Was PI for a number of funded research efforts on those topics. I became interested in cybersecurity, had no background in it, and was looking for a way to kind of break into that space and apply a lot of the past experiences that I had. I located the NorthStar team. They're focused on risk-based vulnerability management. Their products focus on building asset inventories and the exposures lists for particular assets, and they were looking for both bringing in threat intelligence and also developing a prediction capability for determining which CVEs were most likely to be exploited in the wild. So it was a really good match because it pulled together a lot of my past experience and then gave me an opportunity to learn a lot and dive into the computer security field. So, and a lot of what we talk about in this presentation is the outcome of those research efforts. So some of the main points in this talk. So what is a CVE, why it's important, and discussing the growth rate of those on a yearly basis and how that impacts our ability to keep systems secure. So we'll talk a lot about the term exploited in the wild and look into how we can characterize the value of predicting CVEs and which ones will go on to be exploited in the wild in the future. So we're going to take a look at the data that backs the prediction, the research, and the final models. And including one of those is one of the largest real-time open source threat intel feeds that's currently available. So we'll look a lot of data related to CV exploitation and prediction, and how one can go about characterizing prediction performance and measuring the value of a prediction. We'll end up deep diving into some real world examples where the prediction that we talk about in this talk is applied, and then how we assess the prediction performance against those examples. And then we'll wrap up the talk with a list of lessons learned and insights that were taken from this work. One of those insights is how threat intelligence and prediction can work together. So that was a theme that fell out of this work, that you get the benefit of the threat intel, which is able to capture across the internet all of the different footprints and bits and pieces of information that you can pull together to figure out what's going on and how that information can feed a prediction, and then also how that prediction can end up filling in gaps in threat intel, because threat intel doesn't necessarily contain everything that's going on. So okay, so this is a good place to start. CVE growth rate and the walled defense. So our main element that we work with is the CVE, which is a reference number for publicly known information security vulnerabilities. And so there's a master list of these maintained by the MITRE Corporation. And that list is referenced as the gray line in the graph to the left. And then there's another data set called, we reference NVD, the National Vulnerability Database. And so for the CVEs that are on the MITRE list, this is a subset of those where metadata has been provided that helps automate the vulnerability management process. So some of that metadata would include information about how that vulnerability can be exploited, whether it could be exploited over a network or it has to be local, and whether or not availability is compromised or information is compromised. And so there's a number of scores that go along to summarize these vulnerabilities and makes it helpful in terms of trying to rank and decide the severity, which vulnerability within your environment might be the most important to look at that moment in time. And so these lists are growing quite rapidly. You can see there's more CVEs on the MITRE list, 247K than there are on the NVD list, about 195K, and with a 184 having scoring metadata associated with it. So this list of CVEs in an environment gets generated by vulnerability scanners generally. So these are agents or programs that are operating in an environment that are scanning the systems in that environment and reporting back on which vulnerabilities or exposures are on those systems, which we call assets. And oftentimes that vulnerability is reported as a CVE, as this one of these CVE reference numbers. So you can see the rate of growth there is significant. So in 2022, we're growing at a rate of about 85 to 90 CVEs on the MITRE list and about 65 to 70 per day on the NVD list. And you can see it doesn't seem to be slowing down. So one of the challenges is that in an environment, oftentimes they have more of these than they have time to get to. So they're trying to, depending upon where it is it a critical system? How important is that system to the business? How technically critical is that CVE? All these things factor into building a ranking of these things. And one of the most important attributes is, has the CVE been exploited in the wild, and or is it currently being exploited in the wild? So those would be things that would bump the CVEs up to the top of the list very quickly. So here's a snapshot of MITRE's website. So if you go to cve.mitre.org, you can search CVEs, and you'll get a description and list of references. And then also you can see there a link to the National Vulnerability Database. And if you were to follow that link, you'd end up here at nvd.nist.gov. And again, with a description, some quick info when it was published and last modified. And then importantly, down there at the bottom, you can see the CVSS version 3.x and 2.0 with some of the metadata that I mentioned. So a base score here in this instance and a vector, which has a lot of information about that vulnerability. And just to note that version 2.0 is no longer being published since July. So now for new CVEs, they only provide version 3, and there's a different scoring methodology that you could find out on first.org. And it goes through in detail on how these scores are calculated. Okay, so let's start with what is exploited in the wild prediction. So exploited in the wild is a prediction of whether someone will write or obtain an exploit and use it in a cyber attack. So the key part there is that they use it in a cyber attack, that there's evidence that it has been used in a cyber attack, and that evidence, that public exploit may be private, may not be known publicly, but you've received evidence that CVE has been leveraged in an attack. And so our prediction algorithm, it's focused on labeling a CVE as true or false, that we expect it to be exploited in the wild in the future. So at the time we make this prediction, to the best of our knowledge, and we admit, it's very difficult to have perfect knowledge if that's possible. We make a prediction that we'll see in the future, we'll see evidence that that CVE will have been used in an attack. And so for us, we generate this yes or no value because for the folks that consume this information, that tends to be the most useful because it's telling them, yes, you should fix this, or no, we don't have indication that this is that you should fix this. And that's not the only factor that goes into their decision, but it's one of them. So in our view, the CVE that has been or is currently being exploited in the wild, those are the CVEs that are the most important, and they should be fixed first. So knowing that a CVE has been leveraged and attacked, it cuts through, whether or not there was a proof of concept exploit, or whether an exploit exists, or whether it's been weaponized, or whether it could be or could not. Whatever the severity is. I mean, if it was leveraged in an attack, it kind of elevates the importance of knowing that potentially above most of these. Okay, so what is the value of prediction? So this timeline is not exhaustive. It's just to aid our discussion. So the main parts in this would be where the prediction is made. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then so the path of the vulnerability, A, B, C, D, E, and D and E, and then these windows of attack cycle, attack disclosure, and vulnerability disclosure. So we start at A. So vulnerability is discovered by an attacker or a researcher, or it could be a vendor. But A represents the point of discovery. And so B, at some time later after an attack cycle, which here's some of the things that can happen in an attack cycle. So identification of the vulnerability, target identification, reconnaissance, development of proof of concept exploit code, weaponization of the exploit, and potential commoditization of the exploit. So these are things that leave footprints online. So an open source intelligence vendor may capture these by crawling different parts of the internet. And so these are just some of the common things that occur in the attack cycle. So at B, we have an exploit event that occurred. With the relationship between the vulnerability disclosure window and the attack cycle. So vulnerability disclosure is related to how that vulnerability is made public. And so it's a little fuzzy over here. So that attack cycle can start before, it can also start after. So a disclosure might prompt somebody to go out and try to, attack that vulnerability, or the attack and the identification could have happened before there's been any attempt to bring notice to the public about that vulnerability. Okay, so at B, we have the exploit event. This is the actual attack. At C, we have some kind of an awareness. It could be private, and that could be, the person that was attacked. It could be security researchers monitoring things online. It could be, a threat intel vendor who's in some way captured information about that event. But basically, C is inserted in here as like a private awareness before it is ever reached public knowledge. And then D, the exploit event is reported public. And so an example of that would be like our new CISA Kev list, or just a vendor, publishing online. And we put in E here, the exploit event known, because the distance there's takes time for information to travel from D to E. There's many different pathways. Those pathways are becoming more and more organized. But just because something was made public doesn't mean that you necessarily know about it. And so a prediction can drop, along this timeline and have value to different people at different stages of their awareness. And what we'll see is that the prediction has the ability to fill in gaps of information where all the information may not be available, but enough of the pattern exists that a prediction can be made. And then in the absence of complete information, that gives you something potentially to act on that you wouldn't have had since you didn't have all of the information. So just some things to call out here in the vulnerability disclosure window here. So you have pre-CVE. So the vulnerability can be discussed. It might have been reported to MITRE. It might have been assigned, but it hasn't received its actual identifier. And then we have pre-NVD. So that's where the CV number is assigned, but NIST might not have generated any metadata for it yet. So it can be in this state. And then post NVD, we just give this a name where the NVD metadata has been applied. So when we go to assess the value of a prediction, there's cases where it still has value, depending upon how much information the person had before they received it. And then when we evaluate prediction, in this talk, we do so from C&D, where we have some private information through our threat intel, and then we have some public information from the KEV list. So hopefully that's helpful. It's not exhaustive, but I think it provides like a basic, framework for us just for this talk. Okay, so prediction, model creation, and evaluation process. So essentially both step 1 here, evaluation, and step 2, model creation, runs every 24 hours. So in step 1, we've got a set of prior predictions. We've pulled in a bunch of source information here, some of which contains updated exploit in the wild information. So we're comparing prior predictions to new information about exploit in the wild. We're evaluating our predictions. So we've got a set of predictions that have been validated, predictions that have been missed. We have a set of remaining predictions that go back out to our data feed. And then in that same 24-hour cycle, we're creating a new prediction model based on new data and how we've done so far. So we're updating our knowledge bases and our data sources. We're doing a data source selection. So this is choosing the data that's going to be used in that day's machine learning run, generating a number of new models where we assess these models independently and decide on a final model for that day. And then we apply that model to our data and we generate our new predictions, which we also add to our feed. So this describes at a high level, everything that's happening in the background for the process that we're going to discuss. Okay, so a little bit more information on that. So sources. So one of our sources is, as far as we know and we can determine, is the largest threat intel data feed in the industry. It also provides us with some human vetted exploit in the wild data. So this data feed has a subset of information about CVEs that have been seen as exploited in the wild. We also use the NIST NVD data, the exploit DB database, and a couple of other sources. Algorithm details. So this is an online machine learning based algorithm updated every day, heavy on NLP text analysis of the unstructured text that accompanies the CVE descriptions and other data that we can pull in about the CVE. There's other numeric based CVE related features that we derive from threat scores, NVD scores, activity mentions from different online sources, malware analysis, pattern of life analysis that we receive about the CVE that's related to the attack cycle and other stuff. So we generate 2 outputs. One is our predicted CVEs exploited in the wild, and then our known. And so either one of these can be consumed separately or together. And the way I talk about them in this talk is initially I'll talk about feed 1 by itself, but then when I look at the CISA stuff, I'll be talking about these working together on that data set. And it's just an example of the output. So CVE and then the date that that it was predicted. This corresponds to feed one. Okay, so just some information about this threat data. So world's largest real-time collection platform, billions of daily extractions, open and closed sources, technical research, proprietary research. It's multi-language, enriched and vetted by human security experts, also incorporates a number of third-party feeds, and it's constantly evolving itself. New sources added daily, 65 plus threat feeds, pastebin sites, blogs and social media, code repositories, forums, dark web collection, and others. So this vendor is constantly trying to increase their reach and the quality of the data in their data set. So some of the example attributes, so the exploit in the wild label. So some of this is automated online, but then ultimately vetted by a group of researchers. So they do malware hunting, automated malware hunting, automated proof of concept. So some of the scraping of some of the code sites, and they build relationships between the malware and the CVE, modeling of the attack cycle. So the pattern of life analysis that I mentioned, pen test plugins, monitoring security tools, and modeling the relationship between the CVEs and the security tools, and then monitoring vendor advisories. So this is just a little bit more drilled down into some of the data that's consumed as part of that threat intel. Okay, so this gives you just some more insight into the data and also our process, our timeline as things develop. So we began consuming this data summer of 2019. So our initial algorithm development period was in this space, about 6 months in this space here. And then we put the algorithm online and just began watching it. And so a lot of the characterization of its performance is not the internal training test type stuff, but just actually how did it perform? How did it as it was running every day, updating every day, when new CVEs came in and they were marked exploited in the wild, or we found a new list that was developed or that was consolidated that it labeled CVEs as exploited in the wild, how did it do against that? This was this histogram of first seen dates for the CVEs. So this kind of shows the data coming in also from the threat intel. So this is a timeline here, and these are the first seen dates for the CVEs as they came in. So we got a big bump here, and then this shows new data coming in. So this feed, when we first started consuming it at the time, was relatively newer. And then the last seen dates here over time, a histogram of those over time shows when CVEs are getting updated, and this was our last date here. So on a daily basis, we see an update of about 60,000 CVEs get some sort of metadata update from that threat intel. Okay, so there's a difference between, we have a watching versus a predicted set. So we start out with this, all the NVD CVEs that are scored. So we do limit it to the what I call the post NVD set of CVEs at the moment in this talk. That's what this is focused on. So the 184K that I had mentioned back. So this prediction model requires that scoring. So when that scoring does not exist at the moment, we're talking about an algorithm that requires that scoring. So from this 184K, we reduce that to a set of 9% its size that we watch. And that's basically the size that it was here last couple of days when I was making these slides. So this is our watch set. There's evidence that indicates possibility of exploitation, but it hasn't met our threshold yet, and we're not ready to add those to our prediction feed. And so this right here represents our set of CVEs that we're predicting, and that's over the entire 104K set. So, not all of these are, recent. Some of these are quite old, but we run through the entire 184K and based on any updated intelligence that we get. So, and that set is 4.5% the size of that 184K. Okay, so here's a more detailed breakdown of those numbers. So this is CVE date, right? So CVE dash 1988, and then all the way down to 2022. And what you see here is the number of CVEs predicted, and then you see the total number of CVEs, for that particular year. And so you add up all these across all these years, and then you get that 8393, and then we have the 184K. And so you can follow over here onto this. And so this is this line here is basically just what I'm describing over here. And now this line down here, the red line, is the number of CVEs in our threat intel data that have been marked exploited in the wild. So you can see there's quite a big gap between the percentage that we predict and then the actual percentage that's in our threat data that we receive. So we're fairly confident that our threat data does not provide a complete set of exploit in the wild CVEs. It's a sample. It's a very good sample. So, but it definitely is not exhaustive. It will not provide the complete set of CVEs having been or are being exploited in the wild. If you look to the literature, you'll see that the consensus seems to be around 3 to 5% range of CVEs that end up becoming exploited in the wild. So that kind of tracks with our predicted set, but then this is what it is for us. So this is the size of our predicted set, and then this is the actual in that threat intel data. This is the percentage of those CVEs by year that were actually marked exploited in the wild. So there's definitely a gap between the predicted and the validated. Okay, so how do we define prediction performance? So we use three numbers: recall, percent reduction, and then the average number of days ahead. So for recall, that's going to be the percentage of CVEs that were exploited in the wild that we're able to predict. Okay, if there were 100 CVEs that went on in the future to be exploited, and we had confirmation and we predicted 30 of those, then our recall would be 30%. So this is a true test, not just a training test, machine learning split. Okay, percent reduction. The maximum percent of CVEs we can remove from our prediction set while maintaining a desired percentage recall. So, we had our prediction set started with, what do you want to call it, with that big ball to the left on the last slide. We had the 184K CVEs, and we moved across that slide and ultimately had the 8K set of CVEs. So with that percentage of reduction, we're trying to improve that while at the same time, increasing our recall at the same time. So we want that prediction set to be as small as we can get it, because it's hard to get a precision value for that, because when you do a prediction, you can't really get future confirmation unless you do these training test type splits where you're limiting your range of data that you're looking at. So for us, we're just working with this percent reduction, trying to reduce that prediction set size. And then average number of days ahead. So, what is the average number of days? We can actually break that down into different averages based on the age of the CVE, but just generally average number of days ahead that when we got confirmation on a CVE being exploited in the wild, how early were we, right? Just to track how early we are. So this is how we try to characterize it. Is essentially a smaller percent reduction means that someone that's using our data set has to remediate less. A larger recall value means that we're capturing more of the CVEs that are exploited in the wild, and a larger average number of days ahead means that we gave the person that used our data set more time to remediate, which is very important because remediations can take a while sometimes, depending upon what kind of a vulnerability is and what kind of a system it's on. So the more days ahead, the better for a security team. Okay, so the first one here we're going to look at performance-wise, what is against our threat intel, the EIW labeling that we obtained from them. So on our timeline, so on this graph up here, this data is, we consider it private data, but I'm assuming that it's likely that some of this data is public. It's just we consume it in a private manner. But some of it may be private, maybe it is only known to them on their list. But I can say that some of it is also in the public domain. So our period of performance here was from 2020 6/1 to just a few days ago. So in that period of time, there were 893 new CVEs labeled as exploited in the wild by our Intel vendor. During that interval, there were 20 CVEs labeled on the day of the NVD publication. So we can't predict on the day of publication at the moment. It's just there's a little bit of a time lag of more than a day or about a day, so it's hard to assess those. So I pulled those out, but 354 CVEs were predicted exploit in the wild before they were observed by the threat intel. So this is narrow. It's just looking at what we could predict within the threat intel, but we had a 40% recall, and we were about a year ahead on these CVEs here before they actually showed up in the threat intel feed as explicitly labeled as exploited in the wild. So it's difficult to determine, exactly, were we at 1, were we at 2? We can only assess based on what we know at the time of the assessment. So there's no way to have perfect knowledge, but basically for us, that EIW label came in through that consumption of the threat intel, had not been seen before from that vendor or any of the other data that we assessed. And we had a prediction in our prediction set that said that CVE was going to be exploited in the wild. Okay, so just some interesting information about average days ahead. So if we looked at so this is a histogram of an average number of days ahead for the CVEs that we were discussing. If we were to section this off and look at the CVEs that made up these 3 parts here, we were to look at their CVSS base scores, we would see the following graphs. And so some of this is not proof, but it is what we see in the data, is that we were able to predict earlier for CVEs with a more severe base score, and then that the severity of that ends up dropping as we get closer to the actual point of prediction. So the threat intel became more relevant because that's the data that comes in every day and tells us about what's the activity around that CVE? And so, the less severe CVEs get predicted towards the end as the threat intel becomes more relevant. These are harder to figure out for us, anyways. Farther into the future than the more severe ones. And we see this in the CISA example too when we get to it, where the threat intel provides some help with these less severe that are CVEs that are kind of might be missed or ranked out because they're not as severe. Okay, so in this instance, so with the CISA, we add in the exploit in the wild information from our threat intel. So I'm going to recalculate percent reduction here to include that. So we had the 83393 CVEs that were in our prediction set, and we had about 2169 in our exploit in the wild from threat intel. So if we know that they're exploited in the wild already, then we don't need to carry that forward as part of the prediction set. So when we add these two together, we get a prediction set size. It's a little bit larger, but richer because it contains the exploit in the wild information from the private threat intel. And so, but it does lead to a little bit smaller percent reduction. So as I go into the CISA examples, I'm using, instead of just the raw predictions, I'm using this set here that includes the exploit in the wild information from the threat intel. Okay, so the CISA directive. So November 3rd, 2021, this operational directive was released. It was regarded as groundbreaking, and that for the first time, there's timelines given to remediate specific vulnerabilities that they know have been actively exploited by adversaries. So the first set of CVEs, they had 2 weeks to remediate 90 CVEs identified in 2021, and then 6 months to address about 200 CVEs identified between 2017 and 2020. And this is the address for this catalog. So this presented a very unique opportunity because now we had another data set that was public and from a reputable source, and that we could test our prediction in. So how good did we do against this data set here? So let's see. So we're on that timeline. I put us here because this dropped publicly for everybody at the same time. So a unique opportunity, new and independent public data source, backed by a knowledgeable source, focused purely on exploit in the wild vulnerabilities, focused on the most dangerous ones, 287 CVEs on the list in the first day. So up here, this is a histogram of the NVD publication dates. So that looks a little different than just the 2017 to 2022. So, and it's difficult to say average days ahead on a public list like this because I'm assuming that there's some backfilling going on. So some of these may have been publicly known also ahead of time. But it's difficult to know exactly which ones were. So how did we do? So the short answer for those 287, we identified 85.7 of them early, on average about a year before. And it was through a combination of the threat intel and the prediction. So this is also interesting, I think. So over here on this is a histogram of the base scores from NVD. Oh, I'm sorry, base scores from the threat intel feed, and then the threat intel feed that we have, and then also another well-known scanner knowledge base. So those are the 287 CVEs and this histogram, and you can see that the scanner tended to score things less severe than the threat intel, which is interesting. And then what we see over here is that of that 287, 122 were seen in the threat intel early. So that comprised 42.5%. And then 124 were seen in our predictions only, 43.2%. And then what I'm showing here is the histogram of the scoring for the ones identified through threat intel, and then a histogram for the CVEs identified through the predictions. So you can see it's the same sort of phenomenon I was mentioning before, where the threat intel tended to capture the most severe, and even the scanner tended to score the more severe. But then on the predicted side of things, the stuff that was missed by the threat intel, these tended to be scored less severe. So this is where we saw the predictions filling in the gaps on the threat intel, showing them working together. So this is a timeline of, oops, go back there, timeline here of when predictions were made. And this is actually, I mean, the EIW is not really a prediction, but it is in the sense that it was information before ahead of time. It was just on our threat intel. So threat intel coming from the light gray, and then the actual machine learning based prediction coming from the medium gray here, and then the dark gray being the overlap, and how where those occurred on time leading up to the 11/3/21 day. So just showing that on a timeline when those took place. Okay, so that was how we did on the CISA data in November 2021 when it was first released, and this is what's happening today. So these are updated numbers from 11/03/2021 to 9/24/2022. So during that period of time, there was an additional 546 CVEs added to the list. So there were 40 plus updates to that list, where multiple new CVEs were added during each update. So we were able to, the combination of the threat intel and the prediction, we were able to capture 650 of those out of the 833. So 78%, 392, so 47% coming from prediction, 258, 30% coming from the threat intel. There was an overlap where about 125 were predicted early by both threat intel and threat intelligence, but the choice is whichever one came earlier is the one that won the attribution. So, and when we looked at things independently, so let's say that we just removed threat intel altogether, the prediction captured 52% of the CVEs, and threat intel by itself captured 338. And it's difficult to talk exactly about days, average days ahead, because I mean, essentially from my perspective, some of these CVEs are being backfilled. So like, I'm almost positive that some of these are known publicly, but so the average was about 2 years ahead after the remaining CVEs were added to that list. So that just means that we had predictions that were sitting that had already been made, for earlier CVEs that, it just, when they added it to the list, that contributed to the average. Okay, so we'll end the talk with some of the highlights. So we discussed the challenge of the ever-growing set of vulnerabilities and their rate of growth. That was the first diagram that we looked at, where the average rate of growth on a daily basis is from year to year has been increasing, and we're somewhere in the neighborhood of about 75 new CVEs daily. So we discussed some of the motivations and experiences we had creating a machine learning based prediction system. focused on predicting CVEs that be exploited in the wild. We shared the architecture of the prediction system. That's where the system is an online learning, machine learning based system that builds a model every day and evaluates its performance every day. And we discussed how some of the measures we use for characterizing performance. So percent reduction when we're reducing down from that full set of CVEs and NVD that have scores. So approximately reducing that by 95%. The notion of recall, which I'll mention again in the second bullet coming up here. And then days ahead. On average, we're about a year or more, giving a team more time to act to help remediate those CVEs. So we showed prediction performance for 3 real cases. One was against our own threat intel, where we achieved a 40% recall. So 40% of the CVEs we were predicting in the future about a year in advance. And then initially against the CISA list when it first dropped, and we obtained an 85% recall for that list. And then the up-to-date CISA list, we're at about 78% recall for that. And then the overall set of predicted CVEs in our prediction set, it was about 4.5%. And so that conformed to the accepted view about 3 to 5% of CVEs that go on to be exploited in the wild. And then CVEs with lower base scores ended up being predicted later than those with higher base scores. That was the histogram chart that we looked at when we were characterizing our performance against the threat intel data. Those CVEs with lower base scores tended to be predicted closer to the date of actual exploitation. And then prediction seemed to outperform threat intel for the lower scored CVEs, where threat intel seemed to beat prediction for CVEs with the higher base scores. And the next one there, an interesting thing is that our threat intel only actually had a very small number of the CVEs marked as exploited in the wild, about 1.25%. Yet that provided enough information for us to build our prediction model. And that prediction model ended up being responsible for predicting half of the CVEs in the CISA example. So this was, example of where the prediction we think was filling gaps on the threat intel. So, the threat intel is just one source of data, and it was the only one that we used in this set of work. But it's not complete, so might not have had enough data to confirm an EIW, or some other data element might have been missing, but the prediction could fill in the gap. It could generalize beyond that labeled EIW data to achieve the performance that it did. And then we showed that the threat intel and prediction were complementary with some overlap, but not a whole lot. So in the CISA example, there were the 125 CVEs that it overlapped on, but the prediction itself was responsible for almost half of the CVEs that were predicted early in the CISA example. Okay, so that ends the talk. I can take your questions. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.